We begin with a woman in Vienna, 1913. She's trailing a struggling young artist through the streets to a cafe. You see where this is going.
Kill Hitler.
Jump ahead to Leslie Bauman in 1983. She's getting divorced. She leaves her Packard behind in LA and takes the Magna train to visit her mother in New York. The trip takes just over an hour. Clearly some things have changed from the 80s that I remember. She doesn't have much of a relationship with her father beyond cashing the trust fund checks that come, but Mom brings up some skeletons in the family closet. Your father's mother, your paternal grandmother, killed a man, shot him dead. She was a murderer. It happened in Europe. Your father was an infant at the time. Not long after, she inherits her father's estate in London, and with it a mystery that he'd spent much of his life grappling with. Not just the question of why Mum went to Vienna to kill some rando, but a rather perplexing book, as the instructions he left her explain. In the larger of the two bookcases in the study, you will find a volume entitled The Intimate Diary of a London Gentleman. When you have digested this letter, read the final chapter. Then another book on the second shelf awaits your attention, The Time-Life History of the Second World War, which is peculiar in that world, there was no Second World War. All right, let's talk about that aspect of the story. It's going on the assumption that without Hitler, there's no war. Of course, Hitler didn't emerge in a political vacuum. Germany after the Great War was a mess and seething with radicalism. The Weimar government was unable to address the crises and grievances, and it's quite probable that some anti-democratic militant element would take over. You had plenty of communists trying, and on the right there were militarists and monarchists of various stripes, and even something not unlike the Nazi Party could have formed as an alternative to the communists, who didn't do much to distinguish themselves during their brief moments of power. In the conditions that existed in Weimar Germany, there are undoubtedly dozens of potential Hitlers most people have never heard of. That's a counterfactual exploration all on its own. But let's accept the premise that Germany becomes a peaceful, prosperous, democratic partner, and the 20th century plays out very differently. This story goes to some more interesting places in terms of its assumptions. Naturally, I'm going to focus on the historical and political philosophy aspects of it more than the character stories, save for some details that need to be established. The book gives us some little snippets of world building, both in the setting and epigraphs at the start of each chapter. In one case, a newspaper report celebrating Franco's defeat in the Spanish Civil War, which was quite possible without any German aid. Another one is just left hanging there with its implications. Foreign Minister Count Galeazzo Ciano was greeted by cheering crowds in Benghazi, Libya, 2 days after Premier Benito Mussolini's surprise announcement that the colony, after 37 years of benevolent Italian rule, would be granted Dominion status in 1953. In this timeline, fascism is a completely viable political philosophy. It never fell into the Nazi orbit, it didn't get dragged into a losing war, but instead fulfilled its imperial ambitions and stands as a successful reform movement, and presumably a model for others to follow. Interesting, but not a thread that gets tugged on here. Leslie, who has now reclaimed her maiden name, Morning, reads in the Diary of a London Gentleman, attributed simply to B, an account of the author's night with a rather odd and insistent prostitute in London, one who seemed to seek him out specifically. Leslie learns it was in fact Elleander Morning, her grandmother. Your grandmother was the most distinguished madam in all of bloody Britain. If they knew what she'd done, they would have awarded her the Bleeding Victoria Cross. B turns out to be Bertie, a London playwright, and Leslie's grandfather as a result of that encounter. Seems odd all around that he was quite deliberately chosen on that day for reasons that seem inexplicable. More perplexing is the 2-volume World War II book set, full of detailed accounts and photographs of a war that never happened. She shows it to someone she knows in the film industry, thinking that he can explain how the photos were faked, but as near as he can tell, they're authentic. The author, Jerry Yulsman, a World War II vet, was a photographer by trade, and it comes through in the characters' explanations. Soon more people are brought in, each given photocopies of the books to examine before flying to London to view the originals. A respected historian, Francis Boardman, finds the books surprisingly compelling. She was bewildered by the text. Its tempo of events was just too haphazard, too irregular to have been orchestrated out of the raw material of a writer's ordered imagination. She had to remind herself constantly that what she was reading was not the actual panoramic history of a monstrous war, but was indeed fiction, An awesome work. By evening, Frances Boardman was finding it almost impossible to keep herself from believing in the factual reality of what she knew to be a non-event. Brigadier James Entwistle of the Royal Air Force is brought in, as is Field Marshal Rudolf von Seydlitz. Notably, this is a fictional character, not to be confused with this guy who commanded German forces at Stalingrad and later cooperated with the Soviets. The fictionalized Rudolf von Seydlitz becomes a chief villain of the story. I can't really say why the family name was kept, but the actual identity altered for the book. And while Walt was dead at the time of publication, I did wonder while reading it if it was in part to skirt the line of defamation. There's even a little nod in the book hinting at that. On January 24th, one Martin Bormann, a retired insurance broker, filed suit against Time Life Incorporated and the German publishing firm of Franke und Schiller. Bormann claimed libel and defamation of character. He demanded 13 million Deutschmarks in compensatory damages. Later in the month, similar claims were filed by department store owner Rudolf Hess and the estate of Joseph Goebbels, an ex-magazine publisher. Which brings us to the real meat of the story. As more people are shown the books and find them to be a strikingly authentic and haunting piece of fiction, eventually a deal is made for Time Life to publish the volumes, exact copies of the originals, with the addition of a booklet explaining the bizarre story surrounding them. They are somehow surprised when a lot of Germans take this as an attack on the character of their entire nation. The Second World War insults German honor. Anglo-Americans spit on German culture. World War II is political pornography. The misspellings are from the original text. It's supposed to have been taken from a sign at a protest. In that history, some things happened slower. The first atomic bomb was tested in the early 1980s. The Germans built one and popped it off. Curiosity, shits and giggles, who can say. They're also leading in the space race, looking to beat the United States to the moon. The Empire of Japan is a distant third. Like every other work of alternative history, it requires some suspension of disbelief. But it also riffs on that, how fiction has to make sense while the irrational haphazardness of reality must simply be accepted. Not a bad bit of fiction, though there are a few odds and ends that stretch the imagination. You say the books have the Soviets defeating massive German armies. That's a joke. In real life, the poor Ruskies even had problems defeating little Finland, and a decade or so later they lost decisively to the Japanese in only 14 days. And then there's this idea of Britain and communist Russia as allies. Who were the respective leaders? He was aware now that he was actually taking the whole thing seriously. There's similar incredulity when they first come across a photo of this Hitler fellow. Brigadier Entwistle called out, "Begad, Sidney, someone is pulling our leg. This man's a bleeding double for Charlie Chaplin." Side note, the book is full of little gags of varying subtlety. She found herself working methodically, page by page, through the book. Dumbly, she realized she was searching for something. Someone. She discovered him on page 88. And again, it comes back to the idea of Hitler as a necessary causal element, or rather the catalyst for the war, and that by removing him, the whole thing just fizzles out. But Frances, the historian, she sees the importance of the idea of the thing as much as the events. There's a few points that get at one of the core difficulties of a historian's work, of trying to reconstruct the past based on available evidence. And how would you account for all those photographs? We still haven't discredited them. With just those alone in evidence, it becomes impossible to prove that there hasn't actually been a Second World War. "Do you mean, madam," said von Seydlitz, "that there has been?" Frances Boardman was silent. Paul Bauer, the field marshal's nephew, observes another difficulty. Later in his apartment, Paul Bauer realized that the participants that afternoon had taken it all much too seriously. Each of them had drawn from history of the Second World War a reality that suited them. On a more philosophical side, the story is torn between events being the result of vagaries and chance on the one hand, and fate on the other. While all the underlying grievances that fueled Hitler's rise are swept aside in the early part of the story, they return when the World War II volumes are published. The Saar, Alsace-Lorraine, the Sudetenland, Upper Silesia, the Polish Corridor, and more. "But that was over 60 years ago," said Paul. "It matters not," said von Seydlitz. "The lost territories, for the most part, remain German to this day. They belong to us." and the casting of Germany as the villain behind unspeakable crimes, which in that setting would seem like a rather malicious characterization based on nothing but anti-German feeling, sparks a resurgence of German nationalism, of racial identity, and of anti-Semitism. The Elders of Zion, perpetrators of the Second World War myth. And some of the old guard embrace it and try to ride that wave. They plan a coup. A German People's Party is formed with the swastika as its emblem, and dreams of world domination bubble up to the surface as though they're part of an inherent German character, the soul of the people that wants this. As Frances frames it, German culture and social conditions, she said, the very structure of the German language, the cult of blood and iron, the Teutonic talent for cold efficiency and discipline. Forgive me, Field Marshal, but your compatriots are the most ideally equipped of all the Europeans to declare themselves a master race. Only Germany, of all the nations in the world, would be capable of creating a real politic out of anti-Semitism. Never mind the mental contortions of condemning racism by invoking race essentialism. It's this section where the story, for me, goes a bit too far, a bit too simply. Seydlitz dreams of the day he becomes Führer. He sets up a headquarters that he calls the Wolf's Lair. His faction wears swastika armbands, all based on what, in that world, is a work of fiction. It would be like a bunch of generals and politicians seeing Star Wars and deciding that the Empire is a fantastic idea, then proceeding to make a political movement out of it, complete with cosplay, and no one noticing that they're modeling themselves on the bad guys in complete earnest. In the end, they're stopped by an assassination plot that they really should have seen coming, but there's a lingering sense of inevitability. Now the German people have that Nazi myth without the baggage. In that world, the Holocaust deniers are objectively correct. Shortly after, a man walks on the moon for the first time. His first words on the surface, Deutschland über alles. The underlying motivations are still there, waiting to be kindled. And this fatalism is echoed in the convoluted story of Leslie and her grandmother, Elleander. Why the strange encounter described in Bertie's diary? In her first playthrough at life, they were married and had a son. But Bertie bought an overpowered sports car and died in a wreck. After the time travel incident, which is just hand-waved with a wish so the story can happen, though H.G. Wells is brought into it, serving several narrative functions aside from being a bit of an in-joke, they again end up together, though later in life than the first time around. He still buys the car, but she smashes it with an axe. But it seems that Bert can't escape death in a vehicular accident. He charters a private flight across the channel to stop her from reaching Vienna in certain death. But the little plane is tossed about in a storm, and he's thrown from the aircraft. Yet another suggestion that our tragedies can be postponed, but not completely avoided. Like so many others, it seems to be one of those love it or hate it books. I have yet to meet anyone that shares my mixed impressions of it. It's a well-crafted, winding tale of an unfolding mystery, but it's also a somewhat clunky alternate history. It asks important questions and offers varied viewpoints, but it's also, in some ways, problematic in the parlance of our times. The purveyors and partakers of underage prostitution are treated surprisingly favorably at several points. The book feels unfinished in some places, but that can also give it a sense of immediacy that alt history often lacks. When its counterfactual works, it's because it doesn't ask us to accept its world quite so much as just look at our own from outside. It also assumes the importance of the great man in historical events, not only the primary plot device of no Hitler means no war, but Leslie herself. It's the books, that war that never happened, that stirs up all the underlying passions and grievances and sets an echo in motion. If she'd just kept it to herself, burned the volumes and never spoken of it, that catalyst would be absent. She mirrors her grandmother killing Hitler, not only in how she's instrumental in stopping the next aspiring Hitler, but she also provides the inspiration in the first place. And it suggests, or perhaps acknowledges, that there's something not necessarily about the ideology itself, but underneath it that is deeply appealing. On the level of myth or religion, the sort of, deification of the tribe, an industrial scale family bond. As I've said many times before in other videos, people didn't become Nazis because they wanted to be the bad guys, and it wasn't purely a matter of economic promises and reclaiming bits of land. There was something deeper at the root, and that's true of all truly radical movements, whether the Nazis, Marxists, the American Revolution, or Islamic State. The material aspects of an ideology are the trappings, the rationalization for something much more fundamental. And maybe acknowledging that and accepting it is the necessary step to avoiding the ideology trap, something the characters in this story could never quite face head on. Trying to walk on this ice wearing jungle boots is not the smartest thing I've ever done.